So my name is Jonathan Middleborough. I am from the UK, based in London. I'm a lawyer by background. I practiced at the UK bar for around 15 years before retraining as a psychologist. And in my work as a psychologist and as a consultant, I consult to international and national law firms and have worked in Asia, Europe, UK, and a lot in the US. And I also consult to in-house legal departments. And I help on a range of people issues, from issues around motivation and reward through behavioral issues. And I do a lot of executive coaching as well.
Hi, I'm Karam Advani. I'm with Rajah and Tann in Singapore. I practice as a foreign counsel, so effectively off counsel, with a focus on India, and have some experience across a few jurisdictions, namely the US, the UK, and obviously India, and hopefully be able to share some insights that make sense to a few of you.
Hi, I'm Sridhar Gorthi. I'm one of the founding partners of Trilegal. I practice in corporate M&A, and yeah, looking forward to the panel discussion.
Very good, thank you. So we've got a good mix of people here with different perspectives on this. Abhijit, I'm going to ask you first. I'm sorry, you're right next to me. So number one is you've worked in a couple of models here, and you established a new law firm. And I'd like to know what were your plans, what were your ideals that you identified before you set up your law firm, that you said, these are principles that I want this partnership to follow, from your learnings from Europe.
So Valerie, as a theme to the answer, you know, they say there are two kinds of people, at least when you're talking about most of the things in life, is those who don't know and those who don't know that they don't know. I actually don't know. But having said that, well, I've been in, so for my journey it's been pretty interesting. So I would not generalize that. Rajesh here knows we started in Amarchand, we 4 of us in '92. And it grew to what it grew before I left. Till I went to AZB when we were, not AZB, we were 11 people, essentially a sole proprietorship. And we grew to what we grew. My personal experience has been very fantastic in both, because I participated in their growth phases, worked very closely with some prolific minds. As organizations become bigger, they sometimes lose the very character that they were known for. Obviously, also in the last 20 years, the country as such has gone through a lot of things, so it won't be correct to see the legal profession or evolution of firms in isolation of what has happened to the country. What it is now is something I think you have probably analyzed that more than any one of us. But in terms of principles, considering India, I mean, I have not worked outside, I'm qualified in UK, but not worked outside, but watched pretty closely of what this country had gone through in the last 20 years. I think I won't say it's a centric proposition, but it's certainly a very personalized landscape. And when I say landscape, ultimately you create landscape in terms of what the client wants, and you work backwards into what a service provider ultimately becomes. And I think there is a personalized proposition which the client is probably looking for, increasingly less than what they used to, but still personalized. That's one. Two, I think organizations have grown with the thrust of the business that country started generating, as opposed to growing around a particular philosophy. So I think if you ask me in terms of principles, but not principles so much, but beliefs, I think culture is a crying need. And anybody who is able to create a good culture, for example, Sridhar here fantastic. I know from the time they started, fantastic what they've achieved. So anybody who's able to create a good culture and a balance between the tangible and the intangible, I think that probably is something that will sustain until the next phase of changes comes. I think that's my takeaway of the 2 decades.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Jonathan, I will go along one by one here, and then we're going to have a general discussion. So, Jonathan, I was particularly interested because when you're looking at law firm models, the main driver for a law firm model is to achieve something that enables you to reward your people at whatever level that they're happy with, and that incentivizes them. And whatever we talk about lockstep, I don't know if anyone's read the article in the Financial Times just recently about the changes to the dynamics that are driving change even in institutions such as well-known Cravath, where after over 100 years they've lost teams to other law firms, which is something that had been unheard of. And although I'm familiar with that happening in the Magic Circle firms because I've been in the middle of those debates, it is a bit of a wake-up call for everybody that is this the right model? I know why Lockstep developed and what it achieved. And Jonathan, I was, looking for your insight from the people dynamics as to balancing that tension, and there is no perfect answer, but just your observation, that tension between the reward and enabling people to work without the negative of competition, because the lockstep principle is you all take the risk and you all support each other, and you can establish new practice areas because you don't have so much pressure to keep your billable hours up if you're in a new area. So if I've explained that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting debate. And I think the Financial Times article, for those of you who haven't read it, is very interesting. I mean, the principle on which lockstep is based, Valerie correctly identifies, and it's probably slightly ironic that kind of grew up in the crucible of New York, the most kind of capitalist environment probably in the world at the time, and yet in a sense it's a kind of a more socially driven model. Everyone shares the risk, everyone shares the reward, and it's premised on the assumption that you have a particular culture which is pretty homogenous, that everyone is highly educated, everyone is a gentleman, and I use that word advisedly because when that model arose, it was the era of a very male-dominated practice, and everyone shares the same values, and no one is going to game anyone else, so that you're all in it together. You all subscribe to a similar ethos, whereby everyone is expected to, and pretty much does, pull their weight, and competition is with other firms rather than internal. And I think what we're seeing with these developments at Cravath, where for the first time, as Valerie said, 3 senior equity partners, an unheard of thing, have gone off to other firms, is potentially the dissolution of that model. Now, the extent to which that's going to kind of break down remains to be seen. But I think one has to recognize that motivation is a complex thing. And there's no one indicator, there's no one single indicator of motivation, that it varies according to time, it varies according to culture, it varies according to the environment which you're in. I'm sure as part of this discussion we will be considering what works for the Indian environment and whether lockstep works within this environment. The reason why it worked as long as it did in these so-called white shoe firms in New York, the Gravaths and the like, was that there was a very homogenous culture and that everyone subscribed to a certain set of values and everyone had similar motivators, of which money wasn't the only motivation. They were also motivated around status, they were also motivated around being in the right firm. Most of these white shoe firms were WASPy environments where the kids went to the same school, they went to the same private schools, they went to the same universities, and so on. And it would have been unthought of or unheard of for somebody to game another partner. In the words of the song, times they are a-changing.
Yes, yes, thank you, Jonathan. And yes, this debate has been going on for many years because although Cravath has just shocked the world at the moment, of course that debate has gone on in a number of organisations for many years.
Yeah, and as you rightly said, you take those magic circle firms, this is not a new phenomenon there. People have regarded themselves as very portable.
Yeah.
Lockstep has applied in one or two of those firms, but other of those firms have either had mixed lockstep or moved away completely from lockstep a long time ago.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Okay, Karam, can we move on to you, please? Karam comes with a number of observations because he's worked in a number of guises, so has a vast experience and will have a good perspective, somewhat similar to my own, that worked in a number of jurisdictions, so has seen what models might work in India. Karam, can you share with us your perspective on what you know of the way Indian models are, and just observations and any insights you have on what you think would be good principles for Indian law firms?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to digress a bit from the traditional law model and sort of use LPOs as an example. I know earlier.
Look at,
Hello? Can you hear me? As I said, I'm going to digress a bit from a traditional law firm model and just discuss LPOs in general and what has been a traditionally growing phenomenon, which I saw as far back as almost 2002 when I was working with a law firm in LA, Quinn Emanuel. I mean, they've gone on to grow massively. And as far back as now, what is almost 15, 18 years ago, there was a driving need for technology and the understanding that as far as billable hours go, it's going to be unacceptable to clients. They're going to reach a point where they're going to refuse to pay certain rates for certain things. I think we've seen that happen, which is why then India comes to mind. You have an English-speaking population, you have a very well-educated legal population, and you have a talent pool large enough to service the business, as it were. Now, the phenomenon of LPOs has been around in some guise or the other from about the 1950s. Back then, it was mainly patent work, a lot of patent and trademarking work that they undertook. But now, for those who don't know, the sort of the gamut of services offered by LPOs is far more sophisticated in some senses than law firms can even handle. So be it document review, due diligence processes, litigation support, the technology now exists, and manpower. I think as Anand mentioned, yes, technology is not perfect, and so it needs to be a symbiotic relationship. You haven't got to the stage where you can purely rely on technology, which is again why India sort of develops in that, because you have the amount of people to service that. You have thousands of law graduates a year, all of whom are looking for jobs, all of whom now sort of, I think this kind of job sophistication provided by an LPO is very attractive. You come in with American practice models, you bring in systems. I will discuss one in very briefly later, but effectively this has led to the growth. I think the stigma attached to LPOs is sort of diminished as well. People are willing to take on those jobs, people are willing to do those jobs, and people are willing to stay within organizations because they feel empowered. Because of these models imported from the US, from the UK, people see a career in that, and it's not a traditional law career. Yes, the training is intensive, lead times are quite high from when you hire somebody to you actually putting them on a desk. And it's intensive, and it costs a lot to train somebody But what you do provide a client with is very cost-effective mass market services. A lot of litigations or even M&A activity requires immense amounts of due diligence. All sorts of contracts that are not in standard forms. So you end up having to do the contract review, you end up having to standardize contracts, and frankly, it's good billing. People ultimately make money out of it, and people ultimately save money out of it. So it's a model that is taken off. And I think stepping aside from technology, the systems that have developed within it, it's akin to what happened in manufacturing. So there's a system called Six Sigma, which is very popular in a lot of these LPOs, and it was developed by an engineer called Bill Smith, who was at Motorola in the mid-80s, and made incredibly famous by Jack Welch, who was the CEO of General Electric. I think most people will know that name, in around 1995. And what it seeks to do is eliminate defects from processes and sort of effectively implement new processes that are developed over a period of time through analysis. I think one of the key analysis points, the starting point, is what they call the voice of the customer. Hear the voice of the customer. I think a lot of law firms don't realize or may not have fully realized that you are in the service industry. Ultimately, the customer, the client, will drive everything. So by hearing the voice of the customer, you analyze your process, you remove certain defects within it, and then implement a new system. And I think people enjoy that and respond to that because you know where you stand, you know what is expected of you. And then obviously you have technology to support certain things, but it's a good balance between the two because it's people-driven. Ultimately, it's customer-driven and it's internally driven by getting the best out of your people. I'm happy to discuss that a little bit further. I won't take up more time, and I will pass on to Sridhar.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Thank you, and we'll come back to those concepts a bit later on. Now, I think Sridhar, everybody is wanting to hear your views on your trailblazing exercise. I think nobody can call it anything other than that with Trilegal, with their change in their own structure, their approach to it, and what you would advise, what you think you've learned from the exercise, what was good, what was bad. Please share with us that
Thanks a lot,
Thank
Valerie.
you.
So unlike the rest of this panel, I can speak from the experience of a sample size of exactly one. I have not seen any other model, but I think that I've had a ringside view of how our structure has developed, and I can speak to that. You asked the question to Abhijit, when you started, like, what was the idea? So similarly, for us, the idea was to create meritocracy, absolute transparency, and see if that could work as an organizational ethos. And the only structure that aligned with that over time was one of a equity owning partnership. Mm-hmm. But we took our time getting there because this is not something which is very easy to conceive and implement, particularly for a young startup law firm still finding its feet in the business and financially and all of these things. But we had certain ideas which helped us evolve to this model. And the first and foremost of that was there are no assets in the firm. Traditionally, one of the biggest barriers to equity partnership in the old firms has been creation of large assets, whether it is real estate or mostly real estate. Mm-hmm. And we said the only asset in the firm is going to be goodwill, and that belongs to every partner. Mm-hmm. So you start from there. It gives you a lot of flexibility to evolve, and I think that's really the key, because you can't get it right. Even if you get a structure right, as the Cravat example has shown, even if you get the structure right, it works for a certain amount of time. Mm. And then with changes to the business environment, technology environment, aspirations of young lawyers, they're very different from, if I might say, the aspirations of a fresh graduate today are very different from what drove us. And we have to have the flexibility. I mean, for a generation of lawyers, equity partnership was the holy grail. This is what they aspired to from day one of their careers. That's not necessarily true now. and you need different motivators, different drivers. So I think as we evolved, the key was flexibility. We first went to a part equity model. So we had salaried partners, and then you sort of, evolved into the equity ownership. That was creating friction because there were two classes of partnership, and which were being treated differently and had different, therefore, motivations and drivers. And although it was very tempting to keep that, because if you have a salaried partners, you can have a slightly lower threshold. I mean, there's a temptation at least to have a slightly lower threshold for partnership to say, okay, good, not good enough, but good enough to be a salaried partner. And that creates, and we had a huge commitment to quality and a certain standard of service delivery. So all of these things kind of aligned, and we moved to a all equity model. So every partner in the firm is an equity partner. Now, that's of course incredibly empowering and motivating. But at the same time, you have to look out for fairness in reward as well. So a blind lockstep with just constantly just seniority-based reward is not something that will work in an environment as diverse and as dynamic and growth market with very little homogeneity, as as was being mentioned. So you have to adapt that. So you said, okay, pure equity, lockstep, but we have gateways which we evolved, performance parameters based gateways, and subsequently also reward pools for outperformance. And it's completely a work in progress. And all our partners understand this. I think the one rule that we've stuck by is that there is no holy grail. There is no, that this cannot be changed, or that, this is a fundamental principle which we will not change. So we don't have those kind of written in stone sort of things. So that's helped us to kind of keep moving with the times and based on experience.
Thank you. So can I just rephrase something? Are you advocating continuous refinement of your models? So are you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the key really is to learn from experience, and that's been easy for us because it's very intuitive, because nobody's done this. So obviously there are no precedents from which to learn. In the Indian context, nobody's done exactly this. There are different models, and each one of them work for the kind of firm that they are. But for us, this was innovation. This is innovation at its heart of it. So if you lose that, then you kind of lose the essence of what you're doing, right? So we realized that very early, and we communicated this to our partnership. And the idea is absolute transparent communication. So people understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. We make it as collective a decision as we can, as transparent a decision as we can. And it has that buy-in. And this is now part of our DNA, that every once in a while, you have to have some stability as well, so you can't keep changing it. But we remain open to the idea that there will be refinements.
Okay. And can I just make an observation that I found from working in other law firms, that if you spend a lot of time speaking to your people about your principles in which that you're committed to, that time is not wasted. Can I ask the panel their observations on that? Because I think that's one thing that in India it is tended to be viewed as it's a bit too touchy-feely. We don't actually have to do that because it wastes too much time, and it's much better for me to get my head down. But if you talk to people about what your principles are, that's important. So
I'll comment briefly and then maybe hand over to others. I've certainly observed that in India from the exposure I've had to a number of law firms here, that the touchy-feely, as you're calling it, sometimes I kind of cringe slightly when people talk about soft skill training, because you sense that lawyers shiver a little bit because it's touchy-feely and therefore it's not results-focused, and you won't get the outputs. I absolutely agree with Valerie that the time you spend working on these things the larger the organization becomes, is time absolutely not just well spent, but it's an imperative. As you grow an organization, every additional person you bring, if you move from an organization of 20 to 21 to 22 to 50 to 100 to 150, layers and layers of complexity build up, and the dynamics become more and more complicated. To Sridhar's point, you have something as fundamental as a split equity structure as between fixed equity and real equity, salaried partners and real equity, and it brings a whole complicated dynamic and a reticence to talk to your people about this and socialize it and get feedback, which I think is my impression. The Indian way is a reticence to kind of open up a can of worms. That, to my mind, is the wrong approach. The longer you think about this, and an approach, as Sridhar is suggesting, of continuous improvement, of refinement, of continuing to work on it, that's the way to go. It doesn't cause confusion. As long as there's good communication and everyone understands the ground rules, you're really then beginning to tap people's motivation, understanding your workforce, understanding their aspirations, and to your point, Karam, if you understand people's motivations, and there's a whole different generation in terms of motivation, millennials, post-millennials, they want different things, they're looking for different things, they're open to different approaches, different models, you're much more likely to get it right in a sustainable and adaptable way.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I have a view, right? I think in India, I'll Indianize the proposition. Most of the law firm we have, the founders are still alive. So I think communication never goes wrong, but somehow preaching can go wrong. So a lot of it is actually led by conduct. What you stand for is, I think, less of words and more of action, especially when the founders are still alive and into the business. So I think if your actions are going north and your preaching is going south, I think we are probably insulting intelligence of a lot of people.
This is very profound.
And constant communication to that actually is counterproductive. So action is one part. Secondly, what you stand for really comes in your conduct. As such, you have to make some tough decisions, some tough choices. And if your choices are always convenient, I think that tells a story about the so-called principles. So I think I subscribe to what you're saying in terms of constant communication always helps. But talking to people about what you stand for, I think you probably do what you stand for, and the rest will follow, because I assume that you are leading a set of intelligent people. We are in people's business, as I say. In consulting terms, they say you can herd sheep, you can't herd cats. We are in business of herding cats. And when you're addressing cats, you got to have a principle, then you better follow it rather than talk about it.
Yeah, that's a very useful insight to add. I think they're not mutually exclusive, the two, but you're absolutely right. The example is very important to remember, that you have to walk the talk, not just talk about it. So, yeah, thank you for adding that. Karam, could you offer us any observations on what we're just talking about from organizations that you've observed as to the contribution to the ideal model that might apply to India? Perhaps some new concepts from externally.
I guess my experience is slightly different. Quinn Emanuel, or at least as far as that law firm was concerned, back in the day it was considered a sort of trailblazer. A bunch of litigators left public prosecution jobs effectively. Incredibly good public prosecutors got together and said, enough is enough. We want a firm that represents what we want it to represent. So there was a group of partners that got together, and blew the lid off the traditional model in the sense nobody wore suits to work. It was shorts and T-shirts if you wanted. Client meetings and court obviously is different, but for the most part, it was a casual atmosphere, but it didn't mean that you didn't put in the hours, and it didn't mean that you didn't get equivalent compensation.
Yeah.
What it did mean is come comfortably to work, so then you can stay comfortably at work.
Yeah.
And I think that worked well. In Singapore, for the most part, the way Rajah and Tann at least has grown over the last decade has been more collaborative. So you had teams of lawyers come together as against individuals to build a team. And I think that has worked as well. Communication is always the key. Democracy, to a certain extent, is the key because you're not weighed down by founders still being in the business. A couple of them were elevated to the bench and things like that, so they've moved on. Mm-hmm. So the managing partner is elected from the exco, and they tend to conduct themselves that way. Mm-hmm. In India, I think sometimes you are constrained by the vision of the managing partner, the founding partner. So a lot will depend on the individual, but I think there's no harm in collaboration. There's obviously no harm in communication and an open, sort of transparent way of doing things. If for no other reason than people just like to feel involved in the process and just feel better about themselves as a result of that. You feel you have a say, you like a say, and you like to be heard. So obviously a combination of everything. I don't have an answer in terms of what is perfect. I don't have an answer in terms of what is right. I think it depends on the individuals involved. And, but yes, be open to ideas, be fluid, is what I would say.
Okay. Can I just ask each of you, and starting with you, Sridhar, just about the way that you measure performance and how you manage to balance the tension between what I would call gaming the system. Sometimes people do game the system to say, okay, now I know what the calculation is going to be. How can I fiddle it to my advantage and stop that internal rivalry? Because that's what breaks down those principles. Yeah. So.
No, I think first of all, exactly to Abhijit's point, which is that you lead by example. So when we said this is the partnership or the equity belongs to the then partners, not to any one particular partner, but to whoever is the partner at the time of the firm, there was obviously skepticism. But when one of our founders moved out and just left with all his points came back in the system, when we actually started promoting non-founder partners to leadership positions, I think there was a widespread acceptance that these guys aren't going to be here, in my lifetime. And the young partners saw that and saw that there was a very real opportunity for leadership and management. So I think, just to embellish what Abhijit was saying, when they see you implement is when the real motivation comes.
Yeah.
And that's one factor that prevents gaming. A culture of motivated, happy, collegiate people who want to do well for each other, not just for themselves. And for whom that peer recognition of doing well is more motivator, is a greater motivator than the cash they're going to take out of the system. So creating that culture is vital because you cannot police everything. Whatever system you put into place, however sophisticated and how much ever you refine it, if you don't have the right drivers, it will fail. Yeah. So that's the overall overarching kind of principle. But within that, obviously, there have to be some sensible parameters, which again you communicate clearly to your people, and they can't just be monetary. So we have, we have some hard targets, but we also have a lot of soft behavior that we want to see, whether it is cross-selling, promoting new partners, having a junior partner come up and be in good standing in the equity. All these factors come into play, publications. Everything that you are doing for the brand, for the business, for the balance sheet, for the people, all of these things are considered. And then, like I said, we have gateways. So you have time It's not that you're expected to achieve everything, it's not a year-on-year analysis. So that takes a little bit of the advantage of a lockstep. It's not constantly being monitored. But there are gateways which will kind of make it a fair system so that nobody's taking more out of the pie. So, but like I said, overall, if people believe the system is fair, if people believe that there are parts of it that are not working, they can talk about it and then we will fix it. If there is that belief, then, it's a much calmer environment in which you have some of these more difficult, remuneration type conversations.
Okay. No, that's, thank you, that's very useful. Any other observations on those points? Because I'm going to start opening up to the floor, I think, now. Are there any questions from anybody? Yes, Rajah.
I would be curious to understand the views of the panelists in terms of the principles that you followed in terms of the balance between taking home versus investing for future growth.
Yes, please.
I have the mic?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll go first. Look, this is something, again, comes back to what Abhijit said. We started off 5 partners, some buttons and some string, and we kind of put it together from there. So all the junior partners who've been around, and we have a number of lifetimers, who started their careers and are now equity partners. They've all seen this. This is the DNA of the firm. We're constantly investing and putting back into bigger offices, better infrastructure, and all the rest of it. So I think what we do is at the start of the year, we know we're going to spend this much. We budget for it. We know what our profit per point targets are. And it's worked backwards from there. So it's a collective effort. And we all know that if on one particular year, profits are going to be down because we are making this huge sort of office shift, then that's, for everybody to take, because they've seen previous generations do it. So it's not something new. Every generation of partners has made those difficult choices and put that money back. So I think, again, it's a culture thing. And most people are quite accepting of it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sure. You've got a...
I think Sridhar spoke about a very interesting trend that seems to be setting in of not all younger lawyers ultimately wanting or rather aspiring to become partners in places. I'd love to hear a little more in terms of what is that new generational mindset you're seeing when you go out to campuses and all that. How do you really go about selling this concept of, look, you're joining a law firm, you're joining a credible set of people?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. What is the new generation thinking? I don't know. One thing is very clear. We have to stop, and I think this point will resonate across the panel, and I'll be very interested to hear your views as well. This is not a generation that wants to buy houses and own assets and really not being driven by the same motivations that perhaps the generation before. So we have to keep them engaged and motivated in different ways. I worked 18 hours a day and therefore you should work 18 hours a day is not really, I think, going to work beyond a point. The entire environment has changed. The opportunities have changed. So I think we just have to innovate. And I don't, frankly, know exactly what the answer is, but I'll be very happy to hear if you have.
I don't have the answer.
Oh.
No, just to build a little bit on what you were saying and also what Karam was saying earlier in terms of the LPOs. I spent about 5 years with a US organization called Huron Consulting Group, Huron Legal. I suppose one might call them an LPO, they're a consultancy really. But the 90% of their revenue was out of e-discovery and document review and things like that. And their staple workforce in terms of document review were quite well qualified lawyers, but who wanted alternative lifestyles. So they would quite happily clock in for 6-9 months of the year and do other things 3 months of the year, have less reward but still be well rewarded. But what was driving them was something completely different than traditional drivers, and reflects the fact that, as was being said, that for a lot of millennials, post-millennials, it's as much about accumulating life experiences, and growth doesn't just necessarily mean professional growth. It's as much about that as acquiring assets. And so being very much alive to what's floating the boat of your target population, and listening to them and talking to them and not lecturing to them and not telling them they should be working 18-hour days, that's what's really going to uncover what's motivating them. And then you need to adapt your ways of doing business to what's motivating your talent, because it's ultimately the talent that's going to be growing the business. And if the talent is unengaged or disconnected, your business is not going to succeed, however good the technology is.
So actually, you know, everything is said, but the fact is I ask a reverse question to myself at least, right? I mean, we all know, but it's an incredibly talented generation. Incredibly competent people are coming out because they themselves are now competing against a much larger pool and more centers of excellence. So harnessing that talent, actually on the reverse, even if it's for a short period of time, I think can give you a spurt of productivity, which is far higher than harnessing somebody for a very long time. So the question I ask, which is actually keeps me awake at night, how do I keep them continuously interested? Money is given. What more is the question? And you know, the sense of purpose in this generation, or rather if not just interest, is very high. So anybody who's able to innovate on that aspect and keep the generation fascinated, it's a tough task, but well, I guess it's more of a question to us than to them. By now we know the new generation. Enough is said about it.
Yeah, well, I think this is a very good debate to have, because plenty of people are debating this. There isn't a single answer, but if you address it, you might find a solution. Karam, can I just ask if you've got some observations? Clearly, you're in a different jurisdiction. Do you have exactly the same issues that India is experiencing in your experience?
I think you have the same issues with lawyers everywhere. In different stages, obviously. But yeah, I think it has to be motivation. It's exactly empowerment, motivation, which is why you keep hearing these words. I think all of us have used these words repeatedly. So be it firm offsites, be it just move, you know, things like that, that's what people want, that's what people expect. I think people are more demanding these days in terms of experiences that you are obligated to provide people, especially.
Yeah, I was just going to very gently challenge something that Abhijit just said, which is that we already know these people. I challenge that proposition. You know, I've got 2 older kids who are aged 19 and 20, and I've got an 11-year-old. The technology that the 19 and the 20-year-old are using is already pretty much defunct by the time the 11-year-old comes along. You know, one is of the Facebook generation, the other is of God knows whatever the next generation is. So things are moving at a very, very fast speed. And the things that are going to motivate my 19 and 20-year-old are going to be different than the things that are going to motivate someone else's 15-year-old, and different than what's motivating my 11-year-old. So I think one continually needs to learn and to listen and to understand the subtle differences between generations. I mean, a generation used to be every 20, 30 years. A generation now is every 3-5 years. And probably in a few years' time it will be every 6 months. That's you know, somebody will be. I'm probably exaggerating slightly, but I think that this is a fast-moving landscape, watch this space.
Yeah, I think that's, we could debate that for hours, and I may come back to that. Are there any yes, please. Microphone.
Right, I have mine.
Oh, you've got one, sorry, yeah.
Most law firms know what they do and how they do it. How important do you think is why you do it, and whether that's important to communicate externally as well as internally, why you do what you do?
Right, Abhijit, can I start with you, please?
Well, that's a very philosophical question. And I think that permeates not only in legal, but I think by definition, very few people know why they do what they do. But the fact is that I think we've touched upon that what you stand for in a collective situation. What it means individually is one part, but collectively, what Sridhar alluded to in terms of transparency, goodwill staying within the firm. For example, both our firms are not named after anybody. That's part of one of the barriers to talent aggregation is right away removed. So I don't know why you do what you do is an individual question. But what we stand for and what we are trying to accomplish in this professional environment, in the professional life that we may have, that is something which can be somewhat defined with, of course, with what we heard is changing time, things will change, but principles don't change. What you stand for doesn't change. And Jonathan's few things hopefully will still remain elementary. To all the processes. And I think that what you stand for is more important. I think that is something which is demonstratable rather than saying why we do what we do. Of course, it's an economic endeavor. This is not, a charitable endeavor in that sense in any law firm you go to. So that, of course, this is one part. But outside of that, I think the principles and the ethos and the culture, that is something which can be defined.
Yeah, thank you.
If I may, I'm just going to, again, slightly gloss it or slightly challenge. I think it's a really, really important question and a very insightful question. I think it sort of speaks a little bit to kind of the domain space that law firms occupy and aspire to occupy. So I think you've got sort of, one potential mindset that's quite trammeled and says we're a law firm, we know what we do, and it's going to remain broadly similar. And then you've got another mindset, which is actually an alternative mindset, which says, we can change very fundamentally. We can still be a law firm, but our domain can expand in the same way that the domain of the accountancy firms expanded. And some of them became Big Four, and they don't look very much like traditional accountancy firms at all, but they're damn good businesses. They're global businesses, they're incredibly profitable. People have unbelievably fulfilling work experiences there, and ultimately the reason they get so much business is because their clients believe in them. So I think a shift from what to why could be a significant shift in terms of broadening that thinking element.
Yeah, thank you. Sridhar?
I take that very philosophical question and give a very mundane answer. But there is a kernel of truth here. If you take a young associate, we speak of work-life balance, and that phrase, again, cringeworthy at some level. But for what we learned from talking to the younger associates is that there's no work-life balance. Work is very much part of their life. It's what they do for a predominant part of their day. And I think the answer there is the sense of purpose that you were referring to is just a very simple fix, is that we make sure that the quality of the work the way it is allocated across the associate pool, you don't have a certain set of associates just constantly doing, because there are mundane aspects to our job. There are diligences which hopefully with technology will address at some point. But at this time, there are some very mundane tasks that our lawyers still do as part of deals. And then there's the interesting, more structuring, more negotiations, the more exciting stuff, which is, so associate doesn't mind spending 18 hours in office if he's got a ringside view of a high-level negotiation on a complex transaction. No problem. You ask that same associate to spend 10 hours in office going through, a box full of land records. He's going to be tearing his hair out. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a question of giving them, each associate, an opportunity to see the larger picture of what the firm does and what value it is adding to some of these transactions. I think that's a big motivator.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, actually, and that links with what Karam was saying earlier on as well. It's the and that brings us on to another aspect which I hope the day will address, which is the slow take-up of technology to help make the lawyer's professional life more satisfying. So, Karam, you will have an observation on that.
I have some. I was going to say law firms are managed by generally older men, but I would not say that. No, but the underlying philosophy is this: it's an archaic profession. In the large parts of the world, it is still archaic. It is slow to change. It is slow to evolve. The maintenance of the status quo has always been the driving force to some extent. Better you preserve it. And I think that, and I think cost as well. So I've worked with Thomson Reuters on a few things, and I've seen the suite of products that they tend to offer, and especially in an Indian context, the products are expensive. They are good and they can help, but as you were saying, yes, they're not as sophisticated as they could be. The technology has yet to match the ambition in that sense, but it is expensive, and so unless you have a critical sort of mass in terms of turnover, it becomes very difficult to justify investing in the technologies, which is why it goes back to what you had said at the start. It's very simply about case management. It's about uploading certain documents and keeping them for reference purposes and make it easier on that sense, but clients struggle to see the value in it. Also, investments in technology will impact your billing. I think that's a given. If you put the money into these sort of things, it will happen. But what is interesting on the other end of the spectrum is a lot of the big firms have, so be it Allen Overy, Baker McKinsey, Clifford Chance, they sort of have in-house the LPO process. So they've developed that themselves. So I know Clifford Chance had theirs outside Delhi, Baker McKinsey, they all have them in Hyderabad, all over these places, which is why I think India it's a great place to be now for this, or better than it ever has been, obviously. Because as lawyers, you can find jobs. As lawyers, you can find fulfilling jobs. As law firms, it's another revenue stream, frankly, that you can capture. But it does require a hell of a lot of work, which I think a lot of partners especially, you cannot, it takes time, takes a hell of a lot of time to commit to developing that. Which is why these are the reasons I think it takes time. But you can see it growing. Yeah, you can see it growing. And, with especially companies like Reuters, they acquired Pangea 3. There was a reason behind it. It's to integrate their legal publishing business, to bring it all together. Ultimately, the lines will be blurred, I think, for so.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to have to cut it short now because I'm being nagged here, but can I just draw this together? Because one of the main themes that I think we're saying is that a law firm that just has a principle of somebody at the top telling everybody else what to do, those days have gone. And for whatever reason, you've got multi-generational aspects to take into account, and you have to answer all those because people at different levels will have different aspirations themselves. And to continually look at the next generation coming through. So I think it's being flexible, being open-minded, empowering your people in one way or another, transparency throughout. So I'd like to thank my panel. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I could have carried on for a lot longer, as I'm sure some of you would. Sorry I couldn't get to all your questions, but thank you all, panel, and I hope we can repeat this again next year, because it's been very, very good. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the interesting conversation. Can I please invite Vikas to felicitate the panel and the moderator?
It's not snacks. Yeah. Do you want all together photo? Yes. A group hug. Come on. You want-
Try not to fall off the stage. Beyonce, maybe.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you so much again.